This war is not just a contest of force. It is a contest of minds. It is a game of shadows and whispers, of seeing what is not there and not seeing what is. During the Great Conflict of the mid-20th century, the Allied forces knew this. They knew that winning would require more than just soldiers and steel. It would require imagination. It would require fooling the enemy on a scale never before attempted. How do you convince an entire army to look in the wrong direction? How do you create an army out of thin air? Can a single, well-told lie save thousands of lives? The answers lie in some of the most elaborate and audacious deceptions ever conceived. These were not just tricks, they were symphonies of falsehood conducted by intelligence officers, artists, actors, and engineers, all working to bend reality itself. They built ghost armies, invented phantom agents, and gave a dead man a new life to fool the opposition. The stories of these operations reveal a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with explosives, but with information, psychology, and pure, unadulterated nerve. Number 16, could a dead man really change the course of a war? It sounds like fiction. A body washes ashore in a foreign country. In a briefcase chained to its wrist are secret documents. These documents detail an impending military invasion. The enemy finds the body, reads the documents, and believes them. They move their forces to counter the fake invasion, leaving the real target undefended. It is a plot so audacious, it seems destined for failure. Yet, in the spring of 1943, this is exactly what British intelligence planned to do. The operation was called Mincemeat. The strategic problem was simple. The Allies needed to invade southern Europe. The most logical and obvious target was the island of Sicily. The German high command knew this. Everyone knew this. A direct assault would be costly and bloody because the defenders would be waiting. The challenge was to convince the enemy that the Allies were going to attack somewhere else, specifically Greece and Sardinia. This would force them to divert troops and equipment away from Sicily, making the real invasion easier and saving countless lives. But how could they plant this false information in a way that the German command would find completely credible? The idea came from a strange document called the Trout Memo, circulated in 1939 by Rear Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence. The memo, likely co-authored by Godfrey's personal assistant Ian Fleming, who would later create James Bond, was a list of 54 potential deception ideas. Number 28 on the list was the seed of mincemeat. It suggested placing misleading papers on a corpse dressed as an airman and letting it wash ashore. For years, the idea was just a macabre curiosity, but in 1942, as the Sicily invasion loomed, a small team in a basement office decided to make it real. The two masterminds were Ewan Montagu, a naval intelligence officer and lawyer, and Charles Cholmondeley, an eccentric Royal Air Force officer. They worked for the 20 Committee, or XX Committee, the body in charge of controlling double agents. Their job was to think deviously. They began by searching for a suitable body. They needed a man who appeared to have died from drowning at sea with no other signs of trauma. A London coroner, Bentley Purchase, found them a candidate. He was Glyndwr Michael, a man who had died after ingesting poison. His lungs were filled with fluid consistent with drowning. His identity was kept secret for decades. Montagu and Cholmondeley then began the extraordinary process of creating a new life for this body. He would become Captain Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They built a pocket litter, the collection of everyday items a person carries, to make him seem real. They included a letter from his father, an overdraft notice from his bank, stubs for London theater tickets, and a receipt for an engagement ring. They even created a fictional fiancée named Pam, complete with photographs and love letters. Every detail was designed to withstand scrutiny. The letters were written to reflect a specific personality. The dates on the tickets and receipts were chosen to create a plausible timeline of his last days in London. The core of the deception was a set of official-looking letters between high-ranking Allied generals. These letters, placed in a briefcase chained to Major Martin's wrist, explicitly discussed plans to invade Greece and Sardinia, while referring to Sicily only as a feint. The documents were works of art, crafted to sound authentic and to be just the right level of secret. They were not too obvious. They were meant to be discovered by accident. On April 30th, 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva, Spain. Spain was officially neutral, but its government had strong sympathies for the Axis powers and was riddled with German agents. It was the perfect place to drop the body. Montagu and the submarine's crew recited a psalm as they gently slid Major Martin into the water. Now, everything was out of their hands. The tide had to take the body to shore. A local fisherman had to find it. The Spanish authorities had to hand the documents over to the local German agent. Everything went according to plan. The body was found. The Spanish, despite British diplomatic requests for the return of the sensitive documents, made copies. These copies were rushed to Madrid and then to Berlin. The intelligence analysts in the German High Command examined the documents. They debated their authenticity. But the sheer detail, the reality of Major Martin's life as portrayed by his pocket litter was convincing. The German leadership swallowed the bait. Encrypted communications, which the Allies were reading thanks to their code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park, confirmed the success. The message, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker," was sent back to London. The strategic impact was immense. Several German divisions, including 2 panzer divisions, were moved from France and even from the Russian front to Greece and Sardinia. Coastal defenses were strengthened there. Minefields were laid. When the Allies landed in Sicily on July 10th, 1943, they met far less resistance than expected. The island was conquered in just 38 days. The success of Operation Mincemeat is often credited with saving thousands of Allied lives. It was a testament to the power of a well-crafted story. Ben McIntyre's book, Operation Mincemeat, provides a deep dive into the declassified files, revealing the human drama and incredible planning behind the scheme. But even with the files open, questions remain. Was the Spanish cooperation more than just passive? Did some officials in Spain know they were being used and play along for their own political reasons? What was the true fate of the original documents? While the British were assured they were returned unopened, it is almost certain they were expertly opened and resealed. And what of Glyndwr Michael, the man whose body was used? His role was anonymous for over 50 years. Was his selection purely a matter of medical convenience, or were there other factors we still do not know? Number 15, how do you hide an entire army in plain sight? Imagine an army with hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Imagine thousands of soldiers moving into position, their camps lighting up the countryside. Now imagine it is all fake. The tanks are inflatable rubber. The trucks are plywood frames covered in canvas. The artillery guns are made of pipes and old wheels. The soldiers are a handful of men playing recordings of troop movements on massive speakers. This was not a movie set. This was the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was a ghost army, and its mission was to fool the enemy into believing the main D-Day invasion would happen at the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This grand illusion was the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude South, the largest and most complex deception plan of the war. The logic was sound. The Pas-de-Calais is the closest point between England and France. It was the most obvious place to invade. The German High Command was convinced the main attack would come there. The goal of Fortitude was to reinforce this belief so strongly that even after the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944, they would hold their best divisions in reserve, waiting for the real invasion at Calais. The deception had 2 main components, physical and electronic. The physical part was the creation of FUSAG itself. This phantom army was supposedly commanded by one of the most famous and feared Allied generals, General Patton. His assignment to FUSAG was deliberately leaked. The German command respected and feared Patton. They believed only he would be entrusted with leading the main invasion force. His presence gave the Ghost Army credibility. To bring FUSAG to life, the Allies assembled a special unit known officially as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but better known as the Ghost Army. This unit was comprised of about 1,100 men, but their job was to impersonate a force of over 150,000. They were a unique mix of artists, sound engineers, architects, and actors. They used a catalog of tricks. They had hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks, planes, and trucks. From the air or from a distance, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Teams of just a few men could deploy an entire armored battalion in a matter of hours. Then there was the sonic deception. The 3132 Signal Service Company, a component of the Ghost Army, used state-of-the-art technology for the time. They made recordings of troop movements, tank engines, and construction sounds. These recordings were played on powerful speakers that could be heard up to 15 miles away. A convoy of trucks, each carrying a massive speaker, could drive through the English countryside at night, creating the auditory illusion of an entire armored division on the move. They also engaged in spoof radio, creating fake radio traffic. Radio operators would mimic the communication patterns of a real army headquarters, sending out streams of coded but meaningless messages to create the impression of a large active force preparing for an attack. The second component of Fortitude was the use of double agents. Through the double-cross system, British intelligence controlled a network of German agents in Britain. These agents were fed a steady stream of misinformation about Fusag's strength, location, and intentions. The most important of these agents was codenamed Garbo, a Spanish national who had created an entirely fictional network of sub-agents. He sent hundreds of messages to his German handlers, all meticulously crafted by his British case officers, describing in great detail the preparations of Patton's Phantom Army. The German intelligence service trusted Garbo completely. The deception worked better than anyone could have hoped. German reconnaissance planes flew over southeastern England and saw what they expected to see: a massive buildup of forces opposite Calais. Their intelligence reports, bolstered by the radio traffic and the reports from agents like Garbo, confirmed their existing beliefs. On June 6th, when the landings in Normandy began, the German High Command was convinced it was a diversion. They believed the main attack by Patton's Fusag at Calais was still to come. They held back the powerful 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais for several crucial weeks, waiting for an invasion that would never happen. This delay gave the Allies the time they needed to establish and secure their beachhead in Normandy. As Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales document in their book, The Ghost Army of World War II, the creativity of this small unit had a strategic impact far out of proportion to its size. But how complete was the deception, really? We know the German High Command was fooled, but were there skeptical officers at lower levels whose warnings were ignored? How close did a reconnaissance pilot ever get to an inflatable tank? And what would have happened if the rubber nature of the army had been discovered? And what was the psychological toll on the men of the Ghost Army, who used artistry and illusion as weapons of war, knowing that a single mistake could cost thousands of lives? Number 14. How did one man convince an entire intelligence agency he had 27 spies? In the world of espionage, the ultimate prize is not just to intercept the enemy's secrets, but to control the information they receive. The British achieved this through the double-cross system, a sophisticated operation run by the 20XX Committee of MI5. The system's purpose was to capture all German agents sent to Britain, and instead of imprisoning them, turn them into double agents. These controlled agents would then send a mixture of true, harmless information and critically important false information back to their German handlers. The system was a resounding success, but one agent stood out as its undisputed star. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen. His codename was Garbo. Pujol was not a typical spy. He was a former chicken farmer and hotel manager from Barcelona who despised the regimes in both Germany and his own country. He decided on his own to fight for the Allies. In 1941, he approached the British embassy in Madrid multiple times, offering his services as a spy. He was rejected each time. Undeterred, Pujol came up with a new plan. He would pretend to be a pro-German fanatic and offer to spy for them. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, accepted his offer. They gave him a crash course in espionage, some money, and a bottle of invisible ink, and sent him to Britain to build a spy network. Pujol never went to Britain. He went to Lisbon, Portugal. From there, he began to invent his spy network. Using a blue guide to Britain, a dictionary of military terms, and train timetables, he started to create a fictional world. He invented a network of sub-agents, a disgruntled sailor, a Welsh nationalist, a civil servant, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow. He gave them all backstories and personalities. He filed detailed expense reports for their imagined activities. His reports to the Abwehr were a mix of astute observations gleaned from public sources and pure invention. For example, he reported on a large military convoy leaving Liverpool, but got the time slightly wrong because he was working from an old train schedule. The Germans, believing he was in Britain, concluded the convoy had been delayed and praised his accuracy. They had no idea he was writing from a cafe in Lisbon. His reports were so convincing that the British, who were intercepting and decrypting German communications, became alarmed. They were picking up messages about a highly effective German spy network in Britain, but they could find no trace of it. It was a ghost network. After a frantic search, they finally realized the reports all originated from a single source in Lisbon. They tracked Pujol down. When they found him in 1942, they realized they had stumbled upon a genius. They brought him to Britain, gave him the codename Garbo after the famous actress because he was the best actor in the world, and put him to work. Under British control, Garbo's network blossomed. By 1944, he was supposedly running a network of 27 fictional agents, each with their own distinct voice and area of expertise. His British case officer, Thomas Harris, helped him craft hundreds of radio messages and letters. Garbo's reports were the primary channel for feeding the lies of Operation Fortitude to the German High Command. He reported in minute detail on the buildup of the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group under General Patton. He described their troop movements, their insignia, and their preparations for the real invasion at the Pas-de-Calais. His greatest performance came on D-Day. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, he sent a message to his German handlers reporting the Normandy landings, but he framed it as a large-scale diversionary attack. He insisted the main assault on Calais was still imminent. His reports were so trusted that the German command believed him. For weeks after D-Day, they kept vital panzer divisions waiting in the Pas-de-Calais, a decision that proved catastrophic for their defense of Normandy. The German government thought so highly of Garbo that they awarded him the Iron Cross. The British, in turn, awarded him the MBE Member of the Order of the British Empire. He is one of the very few individuals to receive high honors from both sides in the conflict. The story is detailed in books like Agent Garbo by Stefan Talty, which highlights the sheer audacity of Pujol's deception. The Garbo case raises some fundamental questions about intelligence. How could a major intelligence service be so completely fooled by one man with a tourist guidebook? Was it simply Pujol's brilliance, or did the Abwehr's own preconceptions and desire to believe in their star agent blind them to the truth? And the names and roles of his 27 fictional agents, but did any of them have a basis, however loose, in real people Pujol had met? And what became of the vast sums of money the Germans sent to fund this phantom network, money that was collected and controlled by British intelligence? Number 13, what if you could read the enemy's mind? Deception is only effective if you know what the other person believes. You need to understand their fears, their expectations, and their blind spots. During the Second World War, the Allies had a secret weapon that gave them an unprecedented window into the mind of the enemy. It was not a spy or a new technology for surveillance. It was the ability to read their most secret communications. This was the product of the code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park, a country estate in England. The intelligence gleaned from these decrypted messages was codenamed Ultra. The German military relied on a machine called the Enigma to encrypt its communications. They believed it was unbreakable. The machine used a series of rotors to scramble a message into what seemed like random gibberish. The number of possible settings was astronomical. However, thanks to pioneering work by Polish mathematicians in the 1930s and the subsequent efforts of a team of brilliant minds at Bletchley Park, including Alan Turing, the Allies found a way to crack the codes. The success of Bletchley Park was a triumph of mathematics, engineering, and collaboration. They built complex machines called bombs to rapidly test rotor settings and find the daily key. By the middle of the war, they were often reading German Army, Navy, and Air Force communications within hours of them being sent. This intelligence Ultra was perhaps the single most important secret of the war. Ultra was not a deception tactic in itself, but it was the foundation upon which almost all major Allied deceptions were built. It was a force multiplier for deception. Knowing what the enemy was thinking allowed the Allies to craft their lies with surgical precision. For example, when planning Operation Mincemeat, Ultra intercepts confirmed that the German High Command was already worried about a potential invasion of Greece. The Mincemeat plan was therefore designed to play directly into this pre-existing fear, making it far more believable. Similarly, for Operation Fortitude, Ultra was indispensable. Intercepts revealed which German divisions were where, what their commanders believed about Allied intentions, and how effective their aerial reconnaissance was. Most importantly, after the lies were disseminated through double agents like Garbo, Ultra could provide a report card. The Allies could read the German intelligence summaries that discuss Garbo's reports. They could see their own misinformation being repeated and accepted as fact all the way up the chain of command. This feedback loop was crucial. It allowed them to adjust their deception campaign in real time, reinforcing the parts the enemy believed and changing the parts they were skeptical of. But it was like playing poker with the ability to see the other player's cards. The secrecy surrounding Ultra was absolute. The information was so valuable that the Allies sometimes had to make painful decisions. They would occasionally allow an attack to proceed, even when they had advance warning from Ultra to avoid arousing suspicion that the Enigma codes had been broken. They would often stage a discovery of the information through a more conventional source, like a reconnaissance flight, before acting on it. This principle of protecting the source was paramount. F.W. Winterbotham's 1974 book, The Ultra Secret, was one of the first to reveal the story to the public, decades after the war. The existence of Ultra forces us to reconsider the history of the war, which victories were due to battlefield bravery and which were heavily assisted by this secret intelligence. When a German U-boat was sunk, was it luck, or did the convoy know its exact location? And how did the thousands of people who worked at Bletchley Park keep such a monumental secret for so long, even from their own families? The full impact of Ultra on every major decision and deception is still a subject of historical debate. Number 12. How do you make a factory disappear? In an era of aerial bombardment, one of the greatest challenges was protecting vital infrastructure like aircraft factories and military bases. The traditional method was camouflage painting buildings in disruptive patterns to blend in with the landscape. But a group of artists, architects, and Hollywood set designers took this concept to an entirely new level. They did not just try to hide targets, they made them vanish completely, often by hiding them under entire fake neighborhoods. This was large-scale physical deception. The goal was to fool enemy reconnaissance pilots and bombardiers flying at high altitudes. One of the most famous examples was the concealment of the Douglas aircraft plant in Santa Monica, California. This factory was crucial to the war effort, producing thousands of bomber aircraft. Its loss would have been a major blow. So, a team of set designers from the nearby movie studios was brought in to hide it. Led by John Stewart Dudley, a Hollywood art director, the team constructed a massive, sprawling fake suburb on top of the factory's roof in the surrounding airfield. They built fake houses, complete with driveways, garages, and imitation trees and shrubs, made of chicken wire and painted canvas. They had fake cars parked in the driveways. They even had laundry hanging on clotheslines. The entire structure was built on a lightweight framework over the factory buildings. From the air, the 2 million square foot facility looked like a typical piece of Californian suburbia. Workers would enter the factory through hidden entrances, effectively disappearing into the scenery. This project and others like it at places such as the Lockheed Vega plant in Burbank was a masterpiece of illusion. In Britain, the challenge was different. The country was much smaller and closer to enemy airfields. The deceptions had to be even more sophisticated. A special department, the Camouflage Directorate, was established under the command of Colonel John Turner. They employed artists, magicians, and designers to come up with, clever ways to fool the German Air Force. One of their key figures was the magician Jasper Maskelyne, who later made grand claims about his wartime work, some of which are likely exaggerated but point to the creative atmosphere of the unit. They built hundreds of dummy or decoy sites. For every real airfield, they would build several fake ones nearby. These decoys were designed to be just plausible enough to draw fire. They had fake runways, dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas, and even simulated lighting systems. At night, a small team of men could create the illusion of a busy, active airfield. They would use carefully placed lights to simulate landing strips and taxiways. When an air raid began, they would light fires at the decoy site to mimic the effect of a successful bombing run, encouraging subsequent waves of bombers to attack the empty field rather than the real target. These sites were known as Q sites for airfields and starfish sites for cities, where they would simulate the lights of a city and the fires of a raid to draw bombs away from populated areas. The effort was documented in government reports and later explored by historians like Guy Hartcup in his book Camouflage: A History of Concealment and Deception in War. The scale of the operation was enormous. By 1942, Britain had over 230 decoy airfields and nearly 500 decoy urban and industrial sites. The evidence suggests these deceptions were highly effective, drawing a significant percentage of bombs away from their intended targets. But this raises some intriguing questions. How did they measure the success of a decoy? A bomb crater in an empty field is evidence, but how many pilots were fooled but did not drop their bombs for other reasons? What was it like for the small crews manning these decoy sites, whose job was to actively attract enemy bombers? And with modern satellite imagery and analysis, if we were to re-examine wartime aerial photographs of these decoy sites, could we learn new things about the techniques of illusion and how they were perceived from the air? Number 11. Can the sound of an army be as powerful as the army itself? An army is more than just soldiers and vehicles. It is a source of noise. The rumble of tank treads, the shouts of commands, the whine of engines, the clang of construction. In 1944, a specialized unit of the American Army weaponized this noise. They were part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, and their mission was to create auditory illusions on the battlefields of Europe. This was sonic deception, a strange and highly effective form of psychological warfare. The unit at the heart of this effort was the 3132 Signal Service Company Special. They were equipped with a unique arsenal. Instead of guns and tanks, their primary weapons were powerful speakers and turntables mounted on half-tracks. Their ammunition was a library of sound recordings made at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Sound engineers had spent months recording every conceivable sound a military unit could make. They recorded the sounds of Sherman and Panzer tanks, both at rest and on the move. They recorded the sounds of engineers building pontoon bridges, the noises of large groups of soldiers marching, and the chatter of different types of artillery units. These sounds were pressed onto high-fidelity records. In the field, the sonic deception teams could mix and match these recordings to create a custom soundscape of war. The speakers were powerful enough to project these sounds for miles. The concept was simple but brilliant. If you can make the enemy believe a large armored division was massing on their flank, they would have to react. They would have to divert troops, expend resources, and change their plans, all in response to nothing more than a sound recording. The Sonic Deception Unit saw its most significant action in the final months of the war in Europe. One of their most famous missions was Operation Viersen in March 1945. The U.S. Ninth Army needed to cross the Rhine River. To draw enemy attention away from the real crossing point, the Ghost Army was tasked with simulating a crossing by two entire divisions many miles away. The Sonic troops played their recordings for days. They projected the sounds of pontoon bridge construction all through the night. They played the sounds of armored columns moving down to the riverbank. They even had men with flashlights mimic the signals of military police directing traffic that did not exist. The illusion was enhanced by the other elements of the Ghost Army. The visual deception team set up their inflatable tanks. The radio operators created spoof traffic. The combination was a multi-sensory deception. The German forces defending the Rhine took the bait. They heavily shelled the area where the fake crossing was being prepared, wasting valuable ammunition on empty fields. They moved troops to counter the phantom threat. Meanwhile, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine further south with minimal opposition. The effectiveness of sonic deception relied on psychology. In the fog of war, a soldier's or a commander's ears can be as important as their eyes. At night or in dense forest, sound is often the only way to gather intelligence about enemy movements. The Sonic Deception Unit exploited this reliance. They turned the enemy's own senses against them. The story of these sound artists of war is a key part of the Ghost Army narrative, captured in documentaries and books that have brought their once secret mission to light. Yet, mysteries about this tactic persist. How were the sound recordings edited and mixed in the field to be most effective? Was there an art to it, a specific way of fading sounds in and out to create the most realistic effect? Did the enemy ever try to use sonic deception themselves? And if so, how successful were they? And are there any surviving recordings from this sonic library? And what could they tell us about the acoustic environment of a World War II battlefield? Number 10, How do you test an invasion without an army? Sometimes a deception is not about faking a large force, but about making a small force seem like the vanguard of a much larger one. This was the logic behind many commando raids and special operations. While their primary goal might be sabotage, a secondary and equally important goal was often to confuse the enemy and pin down their troops. The raid on the port of Saint-Nazaire in France in March 1942, known as Operation Chariot, is a prime example of a tactical action designed to have a massive strategic and psychological impact. The problem was a dry dock in the port of Saint-Nazaire. It was the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast large enough to service the largest German battleships. As long as this dry dock was operational, these powerful warships could threaten Allied convoys in the Atlantic. The Allies decided they had to destroy it. But a conventional bombing raid was too inaccurate, and a full-scale invasion was impossible. The solution was a daring commando raid. The plan was audacious. They would ram an old destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, packed with delayed action explosives, directly into the gates of the dry dock. The ship itself would become the demolition charge. At the same time, commandos would swarm ashore from small motor launches to destroy other key port facilities like pumping stations and winding mechanisms. The deception element was crucial. To get past the coastal defenses, the Campbelltown was disguised to look like a German destroyer. The raid was incredibly risky. The force of just over 600 men was heading into one of the most heavily defended ports in Europe. The deception only worked for a short time. As the small flotilla neared the port, their disguise was challenged. They used a German signal lamp to send a coded message they had captured in a previous raid. This bought them precious minutes, but eventually the defenders opened fire. The Campbelltown, under a storm of shells, successfully rammed the dock gates. The commandos landed and began their demolition work. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Many of the small boats were destroyed. Many commandos were killed or captured. But the main objective was achieved. Hours later, long after the fighting had ended, and German forces were inspecting the captured ship, the explosives in the bow of the Campbelltown detonated. The massive explosion destroyed the dry dock gates and killed several hundred German soldiers who were on or near the ship. The dock was rendered unusable for the rest of the war. While the primary mission was destruction, the raid served a broader deceptive purpose. It was a powerful message. It showed that the Allies could strike with precision and force anywhere on the long coastline of occupied Europe. This forced the German command to reconsider their defensive strategy. They could no longer assume any port was safe. They had to reinforce garrisons and coastal defenses all along the Atlantic Wall, tying down thousands of troops who could have been used elsewhere, such as on the Eastern Front. The raid created uncertainty and fear, which are key goals of any psychological operation. The story told in books like The Greatest Raid of All by C.E. Lucas Phillips highlights the immense impact a small, well-planned operation could have. But the raid leaves us with questions. How much of the decision to reinforce the entire Atlantic coast was a direct result of the Saint-Nazaire raid versus other strategic factors? We know the raid caused panic and a local investigation, but can we trace its effects all the way to the highest levels of the German command? And what other small raids, less famous than Saint-Nazaire, were conducted primarily for their deceptive or psychological value, forcing the enemy to expend resources defending against ghosts? Number 9. Can you convince an enemy you are attacking a continent you have no intention of invading? While Operation Fortitude was designed to mislead the enemy about the location of the D-Day landings in France, it was not the only major deception plan in 1944. There was a parallel operation just as complex, aimed at a completely different part of Europe. This was Operation Zeppelin. Its goal was to convince the German High Command that a major Allied invasion of the Balkans was imminent. The strategic purpose of Zeppelin was to tie down German divisions in Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia. The Allied planners knew that every soldier, tank, and airplane kept in the Balkans was one less that could be moved to France to fight the Normandy invasion force. The deception was not about a single landing, but a whole campaign. It suggested a three-pronged assault, one from Egypt into Greece, another into Albania from southern Italy, and a third into the Istrian Peninsula of Yugoslavia. Like Fortitude, Zeppelin used a multi-pronged approach. It created phantom armies. The British created the fictional 12th Army in Egypt. This army was given a detailed order of battle, with specific divisions and commanders. Its presence was simulated through a variety of means. A radio traffic was created to mimic the communications of a large headquarters planning an invasion. Dummy landing craft were concentrated in ports in the eastern Mediterranean. Agents and local resistance groups in the Balkans were fed information and asked to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage missions that were consistent with a future landing. For example, they might be asked to report on coastal defenses in a specific area or to target railway lines leading from that area inland. Political deception was also a key component. The Allies engaged in diplomatic maneuvering with neutral countries like Turkey, suggesting they were seeking permission to move troops through their territory. They staged high-level meetings in Cairo and other Mediterranean cities, ensuring that news of these planning conferences would leak to German intelligence. They even created a fake training school for Greek interpreters in Egypt, a small but clever detail to add to the overall picture of an impending invasion of Greece. The double agent network was also activated in support of Zeppelin. Agents in the eastern Mediterranean fed a steady stream of reports to the Germans about the buildup of the 12th Army, the movement of shipping, and the political rumors circulating in Cairo. This constant flow of mutually reinforcing information, from radio intercepts to agent reports to physical sightings of dummy equipment, created a compelling narrative. The German command was susceptible to this deception. They had long been concerned about the security of the Balkans, which were a vital source of raw materials like oil and bauxite. The region was also rife with partisan activity, making it inherently unstable. Operation Zeppelin played on these existing anxieties. The German intelligence services took the threat seriously. By the spring of 1944, they had an estimated 25 divisions stationed in the Balkans. They were waiting for an invasion that would never come. While the main battle for Europe was being fought in the fields of Normandy, a significant portion of the German army was pinned down hundreds of miles away, guarding against a phantom threat. This story of strategic misdirection is detailed in Michael Howard's official history, Strategic Deception in the Second World War. Yet, we can still ask about the specifics. How did the German commanders in the Balkans perceive the threat? Did their reports to the high command reflect total belief in the deception, or were there notes of skepticism? How much of the partisan activity in the region was genuinely spontaneous, and how much was subtly directed by the Allies to support the Zeppelin narrative? And could Operation Zeppelin have been even more successful if it had been given more resources, or was it perfectly calibrated as a secondary but vital deception? Number 8, how do you use an actor to impersonate a general? And deception can take many forms. Some are grand and strategic, involving entire phantom armies. Others are small, intimate, and rely on the skills of a single person. One of the most unusual and daring deceptions of the war involved using an actor to impersonate a famous general to fool enemy intelligence. The operation was codenamed Copperhead. The general was Bernard Montgomery. The actor was Emmy Clifton James. In late May 1944, just days before the D-Day invasion, the Allied planners wanted one last trick to reinforce the idea that the invasion was not imminent. They wanted to make the German high command believe that one of their most important generals, Montgomery, was not in Britain preparing for an invasion, but was instead on a tour of the Mediterranean. If Montgomery was in North Africa, the reasoning went, then the invasion could not be happening in the next few days. The problem was that Montgomery was, of course, in Britain, busy with the final preparations. The solution came from an intelligence officer who had seen a photograph of a man in the Army's entertainment division who bore a striking resemblance to the famous general. That man was Lieutenant Emmy Clifton James. Before the war, James had been a professional actor in Australia and Britain. He was not a perfect double, but the resemblance was strong. James was summoned to London and sworn to secrecy. For several days, he studied Montgomery. He watched newsreels to learn his distinctive walk and mannerisms. He listened to recordings of his voice to capture his clipped, decisive tone. He even spent time with Montgomery himself, who was reportedly amused by the scheme. James was a heavy smoker and drinker, while Montgomery was a teetotaler, so he had to practice abstinence to stay in character. The plan was for James, as Montgomery, to fly to Gibraltar and then to Algiers. The trip was carefully stage-managed. He was flown in Prime Minister Churchill's personal aircraft. When he arrived in Gibraltar, he was met by the governor and other high-ranking officials, all of whom were in on the secret. They had a public dinner where James, as Montgomery, made comments that were intended to be overheard by spies known to be operating in the area. He deliberately talked about a plan for a major operation in the south of France. The charade continued in Algiers. He was driven in a staff car with the general's official insignia. He met with General Maitland Wilson, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean. The whole performance was designed to be seen and reported by the network of German and Spanish agents in the region. After a few days of very public appearances, Montgomery was flown to a secret location in Egypt, and Clifton James resumed his old identity and was kept out of sight until after the Normandy invasion was well underway. He later told his story in his autobiography, I Was Monty's Double. Did it work? It is one of the most difficult deceptions to assess. Intercepted German communication showed that the reports of Montgomery's presence in Gibraltar did reach the German high command. The intelligence reports noted it and were puzzled by it. However, it is impossible to say with certainty that this single piece of information had a decisive impact on German decision-making in the crucial days before June 6th. It was just one more piece of a much larger mosaic of deception created by Operation Fortitude. It was a small, clever tactic designed to add a little more confusion and uncertainty at a critical moment. This raises questions about the nature of such spot deceptions. Was Operation Copperhead worth the risk and resources? How did the Allied planners prevent the real Montgomery from being seen in public in Britain while his double was in the Mediterranean? And what psychological effect did it have on Clifton James, the actor, to briefly hold the identity of one of the most famous men in the world, knowing the potential consequences of a flawed performance? Number 7, can a fake weapon be more useful than a real one? Not all deception involved grand strategy or elaborate spy networks. Some of the most ingenious deceptions were purely technical. They involved creating fake equipment that was so realistic it could fool the enemy, and so clever it could perform tasks real equipment could not. A perfect example of this is the dummy paratrooper. In the early hours of D-Day, before the main seaborne invasion force hit the beaches, Allied aircraft dropped thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines. Their job was to seize key bridges, crossroads, and cause chaos among the defenders. But alongside the real paratroopers, the Allies dropped something else small, dummy paratroopers. These were nicknamed Ruperts by the British and Oscars by the Americans. A Rupert was a simple but brilliant invention. And it was a small burlap doll about 3 feet high, stuffed with straw or wood shavings. It was designed to look, from a distance and in the dark, like a descending paratrooper. They were dropped in large numbers in areas away from the real parachute drop zones. The deception was enhanced with clever pyrotechnics. Attached to each Rupert was a device that would simulate the sound of rifle and machine gun fire upon landing. Other devices would set off small explosive charges. The goal was to create the illusion of a massive airborne assault in the wrong place. The plan worked. German units across Normandy reported large-scale parachute landings in multiple locations. These reports flooded their command centers, creating confusion and uncertainty about where the main airborne threat was. In response, German reserve units were sent on wild goose chases, hunting for phantom paratroopers in empty fields and forests. This diverted them from the real drop zones, giving the actual paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions precious time to regroup and achieve their objectives with less opposition. This was a classic diversionary tactic. It used a small investment of resources, some burlap sacks and simple noisemakers to tie up a much larger and more valuable enemy force. The effectiveness of the Ruperts is documented in the operational histories of the D-Day landings. Reports from German prisoners of war later confirmed that they had been completely fooled by the dummies and the accompanying sound effects. A similar principle was applied to aerial warfare. The British firm Martin Baker, now famous for its ejector seats, was involved in a project to create dummy aircraft. These were not just static models like those used by the Ghost Army. They were engineered structures designed to be towed by bomber aircraft. The idea was to create the illusion of a much larger bomber formation. One scheme involved towing large glider-like structures that would reflect radar signals, making a small group of planes look like a massive armada. Another idea was to have fighters tow dummy bombers made of lightweight material. These projects were technically complex and had mixed results, but they show the extent to which engineers were thinking about technical deception. This use of fake equipment raises some interesting points. Who designed the Rupert dolls, and how did they test them to ensure they were effective? Were there other similar inventions that were proposed but never used? For example, were there ever plans for dummy landing craft or other naval decoys? And in an age of advanced sensors, is the principle of the simple low-tech dummy, like Rupert, still a viable tactic on the modern battlefield? Number 6, how do you trick a submarine into revealing itself? The war in the Atlantic was a long, brutal struggle over supply lines. German U-boats, operating in wolf packs, sank millions of tons of Allied shipping. For a merchant ship, a U-boat was a silent, invisible predator. The Allies needed a way to fight back, to turn the hunter into the hunted. One of the solutions they revived from the First World War was the Q-ship. A Q-ship was a deception incarnate. It was a heavily armed warship disguised as a harmless, often dilapidated merchant vessel. The guns were hidden behind fake bulkheads, inside false shipping crates, or under collapsible structures on the deck. The crew was trained to act like undisciplined merchant sailors. The ship might fly the flag of a neutral country. The goal was to lure a U-boat to the surface. U-boats preferred to attack with torpedoes from a submerged position. However, torpedoes were expensive and limited in number. If a target seemed weak and unthreatening, like a lone, slow-moving tramp steamer, a U-boat commander might choose to surface and sink it with his cheaper and more plentiful deck gun. This was the moment the Q-ship was waiting for. When the U-boat surfaced and prepared to attack, the Q-ship would go into its act. A small, designated panic party of sailors would make a great show of abandoning ship, launching a lifeboat in a clumsy and chaotic manner. This was designed to convince the U-boat commander that the ship was helpless and its crew was defeated. The U-boat would then move in closer to finish the job. Once the submarine was at close range, typically just a few hundred yards away, the Q-ship's commander would give the order. The disguise would drop away, panels would fall, flags would be raised, and the hidden guns would be revealed. The Q-ship would open fire with all its weapons, hoping to destroy or fatally damage the submarine before it could submerge. The life of a Q-ship crew was incredibly stressful. They had to sail alone, inviting attack. They had to endure being shelled by the submarine without firing back until it was close enough for their own guns to be effective. Their ship had to absorb damage while the deception played out. Several Q-ships were sunk when the U-boat commander chose not to take the bait and fired a torpedo instead. The psychological pressure on the crew was immense. While Q-ships had some notable successes, their overall effectiveness in the Second World War is a matter of debate. U-boat tactics had changed since the First War. They were more cautious and more likely to attack in groups and at night. However, the Q-ship represents a fascinating form of deception where the trap is not an object or a piece of information, but the ship and crew itself. The story of these ships, such as the USS Bighorn, is a tale of calculated risk and immense bravery. But their history leaves many questions unanswered. How were the crews for these dangerous missions selected and trained? What was the psychological profile of a sailor who could pretend to panic and abandon his ship while under enemy fire? Did the German Navy have a standard doctrine for dealing with suspected Q-ships? And how did it evolve over the course of the war? And are there any recorded instances where a U-boat commander realized the trap at the last second and managed to escape? Number 5, can a map in the wrong hands start a war? Sometimes a deception is not about a single operation, but about creating a general atmosphere of threat and uncertainty. In 1940 and 1941, before the United States entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was trying to build public and political support for aiding the Allies. To do this, he needed to convince the American people that they were facing a direct threat. He unveiled a piece of intelligence that seemed to provide exactly that proof, a map. In a radio address on October 27, 1941, Roosevelt announced that he had in his possession a secret map made by the German government. This map, he claimed, detailed a plan to reorganize Central and South America. It showed the continent carved up into 5 new vassal states, all under German control. He presented this map as concrete evidence of a plan for world domination that extended to the Western Hemisphere. The map suggested that the plan was not just to control Europe, but to move on to the Americas next. The map was a bombshell. It was published in newspapers across the country. For many Americans who had been hesitant to get involved in a European war, this was a shocking revelation. It brought the threat directly to their doorstep. The map seemed to be an authentic German document, a look inside the secret plans of a hostile power. It helped to sway public opinion and build support for Roosevelt's policies of providing aid to Britain. But was the map real? The historical consensus, as detailed by researchers like Nick Cull in his work on propaganda, is that the map was a British forgery created by their intelligence services. It was a piece of black propaganda, information designed to look like it came from the enemy. British intelligence had become masters of creating plausible-looking documents, and this map was one of their greatest successes. It was likely passed to the Americans through the British Security Coordination BSC, a British intelligence agency based in New York City. The map was perfectly designed to alarm the American public. It played on existing fears and was simple enough for everyone to understand. The visual impact of seeing a familiar map redrawn by a foreign power was immense. It was a brilliant piece of political deception using a single document to shape the political debate of a nation. Roosevelt himself may or may not have known for certain that the map was a fake. He may have believed it was genuine, or he may have suspected its origin but considered it too useful politically not to use. The story of the German map of South America is a powerful example of how deception can be used not just on the battlefield, but in the political arena. It shows how a well-crafted piece of disinformation can influence public opinion and alter the course of history. This episode leaves behind some tantalizing questions. Who is the specific artist or cartographer in British intelligence who designed and created the map? How did they ensure its details were just plausible enough to be believed? We know the map was passed to the Americans, but what was the exact chain of custody? And did President Roosevelt ever privately acknowledge to his inner circle that he suspected the map's true origins? The full story of this influential forgery may still be hidden in classified archives. Number 4. What is the difference between a raid and a lie? In December 1942, a small group of British Royal Marines conducted one of the most daring commando raids of the war. Known as Operation Frankton, the mission's story was later immortalized in the film The Cockleshell Heroes. A team of 10 men in 5 collapsible canoes were launched from a submarine off the coast of France. Their mission was to paddle 60 miles up the Gironde estuary to the port of Bordeaux and use limpet mines to sink merchant ships. The raid itself was a remarkable feat of endurance and courage. Only 2 of the 10 men survived, but the raid also had a hidden, deceptive purpose. At this stage of the war, the British were developing their special forces capabilities. They wanted the German command to believe that they had a large and highly effective force of commandos capable of striking anywhere. Every successful raid, no matter how small, contributed to this perception. The Bordeaux raid was designed to be a spectacular success that would have a psychological impact far beyond the actual damage caused. The sinking of several ships in a heavily guarded port, hundreds of miles from the sea, by a handful of men in canoes, was a shocking event for the German defenders. It created a sense of vulnerability. It forced them to increase security at all their Atlantic ports. It meant more guards, more patrols, and more resources diverted to defense. This was the deceptive effect of the raid. It made the threat of commando operations seem larger and more potent than it actually was at the time. This tactic of using real, but small, military actions to create a false impression of a much larger capability is a subtle form of deception. It is not about creating something from nothing, like a ghost army. It is about amplifying the truth. Every commando raid, every act of sabotage by special forces was not just a military operation. It was also a form of communication. It was a message to the enemy designed to create fear, uncertainty, and to force them to expend their resources inefficiently. This principle was applied by special forces on all sides of the conflict. The British Special Air Service SAS, operating in North Africa, for example, would conduct lightning raids on enemy airfields, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground. These raids had a direct military impact, but they also created a legend. They forced the Axis forces to pull troops back from the front line to guard their rear areas, weakening their overall strength. This raises a fascinating question about military strategy. At what point does a military operation cross the line from being a purely tactical action to being a deliberate act of deception? How did the planners of raids like Operation Frankton calculate the potential psychological and deceptive impact of their missions? And are there examples of raids that were conducted almost entirely for their deceptive value, with the physical damage being only a secondary consideration? Number 3, can you fool a pilot without an airplane? Throughout the war, airfields were prime targets. Losing aircraft on the ground was just as bad as losing them in the air. As discussed with decoy Q sites, one way to protect airfields was to build fakes to draw away bombs. But there was another, more subtle approach used at the real airfields. This involved creating fake aircraft to fool enemy reconnaissance pilots into misjudging the strength and readiness of an air force. The creation of dummy aircraft was a serious business. They ranged from simple, two-dimensional flat silhouettes to highly detailed, full-scale models made of wood, canvas, and other non-strategic materials. These dummies, often called dummies Type K by the British, were placed on real airfields interspersed with the real planes. The goal was to inflate the apparent number of aircraft at a given base. An enemy reconnaissance pilot flying overhead would take photographs. Back at his base, intelligence analysts would count the aircraft and conclude that the airfield was much stronger than it actually was. This could have several effects. It could deter an attack, as the enemy might decide the target was too well defended. Or it could lead them to overestimate the size of the air force they were facing, causing them to make strategic errors. The deception was often in the details. The dummy aircraft would be moved around periodically to give the impression of activity. Sometimes they would even simulate maintenance work being done on them. The opposite was also true. Sometimes the goal was to make a strong airfield look weak or abandoned. This could be done by removing most of the real aircraft to dispersed, hidden locations and leaving only a few dummy aircraft or old, non-functional planes on the main airfield. This might lure the enemy into attacking what they believe was a weak and easy target, only to be surprised by a strong fighter defense from hidden satellite fields. This type of deception was not limited to aircraft. The same principles were used at naval bases with dummy submarines and ships, and in army camps with the inflatable tanks of the Ghost Army. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, with each side trying to create a false picture of their own strength while trying to penetrate the deceptions of the other. The effectiveness of these dummy assets is hard to quantify, but they were a standard part of the deception toolkit. They were cheap, easy to produce, and forced the enemy to expend resources, time, fuel for reconnaissance flights, and analytical effort trying to distinguish the real from the fake. But how sophisticated did this game get? Were there specific styles of dummy aircraft designed to mimic specific models, like Spitfires or Messerschmitts? How were the dummies weathered and painted to look realistic under different lighting conditions? And did reconnaissance pilots develop specific techniques to try to spot the fakes, such as looking for the lack of oil stains on the ground beneath the engines? Number 2, how do you stage an invasion that never was? Sometimes the best way to hide a real invasion is to plan a fake one so thoroughly that it seems real even to the people involved in planning it. Before the Allied invasion of Italy at Anzio in January 1944, codenamed Operation Shingle, the Allies executed a clever naval deception to confuse the defenders. The plan for Shingle was to land troops behind the main German defensive line in Italy, the Gustav Line. The landing at Anzio was intended to outflank the enemy and open the way to Rome. To achieve surprise, the Allies needed to convince the German command that the amphibious landing was going to happen somewhere else. They chose a spot north of Rome, at Civitavecchia. To make the threat to Civitavecchia seem real, the Allies assembled a fake invasion fleet at the port of Naples. They gathered a large number of transport ships and landing craft. These ships were loaded with troops from the U.S. 36th Division. The soldiers were fully briefed and equipped for a landing at Civitavecchia. They believed it was a real mission. The convoy set sail from Naples and headed north, directly towards the fake target. The movement of this large fleet was designed to be seen. Allied radio traffic broadcast messages consistent with a major landing operation. The German intelligence services picked up all these signals. They saw the ships moving north, they intercepted the radio traffic, everything pointed to a landing at Civitavecchia. In response, they moved their reserve forces, including the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, to positions where they could counter this expected invasion. Then, at a predetermined point at sea, the deception reached its climax. The main invasion fleet for Anzio, which had been concealed and had sailed on a different course, turned towards its real target. The diversionary fleet, the one heading for Civitavecchia, turned around and sailed back to Naples. The soldiers on board, who had been preparing for a major battle, were told that the operation had been cancelled due to bad weather. The deception worked perfectly. The German reserves were out of position. By the time they realized they had been fooled and that the real landing was happening much further south at Anzio, the Allies had already established a beachhead. The initial landing at Anzio met with very little opposition, a success due in large part to this well-executed naval feint. This operation raises some interesting ethical and psychological questions. What was the effect on the morale of the troops of the 36th Division who were prepared for a life-or-death battle, only to be told it was a drill? How did the planners ensure that the secret of the feint did not leak out, especially when so many soldiers and sailors were involved in the fake convoy? And were there other similar naval deceptions that were planned but never executed? Number one, can a lie be true? The greatest deception of the Second World War was arguably the one the Allies told themselves. It was the belief that victory was inevitable. In the dark days of 1940 and 1941, the situation was grim. Much of Europe was occupied. Britain stood alone. The United States was not yet in the war. By any rational calculation, the odds were long. Yet, Allied leaders, most notably Winston Churchill, projected an unwavering confidence. Through his speeches and public appearances, Churchill created a narrative of defiance and ultimate victory. He spoke of fighting on the beaches and in the fields. He promised not victory in the short term, but survival and eventual certain triumph. This was more than just good leadership. It was a form of psychological operation directed at his own people. This narrative of inevitable victory served several purposes. It maintained public morale at home, which was crucial during the Blitz and the long years of rationing and hardship. It gave hope to the resistance movements in occupied countries, and it sent a message to the United States that Britain was a worthwhile investment, a nation that would not surrender and was worth supporting with supplies and, eventually, troops. This grand strategic deception was not based on lies in the traditional sense. It was based on a deliberate and sustained projection of confidence that was not always supported by the immediate facts on the ground. It was an act of collective will, a decision to believe in a future that was, at the time, far from certain. The leaders had to convince their own people, their own armies, and their allies that they could win, even when the path to winning was not at all clear. This is perhaps the most profound form of deception, the one that becomes true because people believe in it. The belief in victory motivated soldiers to fight, factory workers to produce, and citizens to endure. It was the psychological foundation upon which the entire war effort was built. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The lie, or perhaps the hope, became the truth. This idea forces us to ask some fundamental questions about war and human nature. How much of victory in any conflict is determined by material factors like tanks and planes, and how much is determined by intangible factors like morale, will, and belief? Can a leader's words truly be as powerful as an army? And in the darkest of times, is the greatest deception of all the one that gives people the hope they need to carry on?